Thank you very much, Professor Tanner, not only for that kind introduction and for agreeing to preside here today, but also for the efforts that you've made, not only in months, but years in the past, to assure that your country, our country, does not abandon its ideals as it tries to support democratic forces in the Middle East. Our job here today should be relatively easy. In several countries in the Middle East, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, in Bahrain, the United States has been struggling to identify and to support people and forces that stand for democratic reform, that want to introduce systems of governance in their countries that will pursue the welfare of their citizens and not threaten the welfare of their neighbors, and not to support people who stand for terrorizing their own citizens and their own neighbors. In some places, that's genuinely hard to do, and the President and his administration have persisted in making the effort, whether it's a decisive blow like killing Osama bin Laden or a diligent attempt to find ways to get rid of Muammar Gaddafi. And what has been the response of the mullahs in Iran to these historic events going on around them? Well, for one thing, Iran has provided help to the worst elements in the Middle East, not only to Hamas and Hezbollah. It has actually provided the Assad regime with snipers who have helped that regime terrorize and murder its own citizens. Domestically, the Iranian regime in 2011 alone has hanged almost 150 people whose only crime was to oppose repression. And late last week, the regime announced that it was developing an alternative internet that will have the effect of sealing Iran off from the rest of the world so that Iranians cannot be influenced by the ideas and ideals that are sweeping the world in general and their part of the world in particular. And so the rest of the world cannot see, hear, and read about the violence and repression that's being inflicted on Iranian citizens by their own government. There may be little that our government can do directly to break the grip of the mullahs at this particular point. And yet, there seems to be one simple and constructive step that the United States could take that seems repeatedly to elude us. And that is not a step that requires a great investment of wealth or that places our armed forces at risk. It involves simply having the moral courage to admit that a past policy pursued over several administrations, Democrat and Republican, has outlived its usefulness, if indeed it ever had any usefulness. I refer, of course, to the mistaken policy of continuing to list the MEK as a foreign terrorist organization. The history here is familiar, but nonetheless it bears repeating. In the 1990s, as a goodwill gesture to the regime in Tehran, our government placed the MEK on that list. By all accounts, this was done so as to help us engage with the regime in Tehran and perhaps get that regime to behave as a responsible member of the world community. Whether that policy was wise or foolish, there's no mistaking that it failed. Repeatedly, the Iranian regime has grown only more hostile and more threatening toward the United States and toward its neighbors. In the administration in which I served, that designation was continued, this time out of fear that if MEK were delisted, the Iranians would provide weapons, including deadly IEDs, to insurgents in Iraq. This policy, too, was a failure, because although the designation continued, Iran supplied deadly weapons, including IEDs, to those insurgents. If indeed the MEK engaged in violence in the 1970s, it has long since renounced those means. Today, and for years before today, MEK stands explicitly for establishing a democratic, non-nuclear, secular republic in Iran. Its members who live in Iraq and Camp Ashraf have given up the weapons they might have used to defend themselves and put their welfare in the hands of coalition forces after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. They accepted the solemn assurances of the coalition, and specifically of American generals, that they would be treated as protected persons under international law. Instead of pursuing violence, The MEK has put itself in the hands of this country and our institutions. And so in addition to accepting the word of our military that residents of Ashraf would be protected, the MEK took to our courts to undo the unjust designation by resorting to the law. After all, if an organization cannot be treated under the law as a foreign terrorist organization, unless it either engages in terrorism that threatens the welfare of the United States or has the capability and intent to do so, then the MEK, which has renounced violence, should have no difficulty getting itself off that list. And so in July of 2010, the MEK won a ruling from the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit that the Secretary of State must reconsider the designation of MEK as a foreign terrorist organization because the information she was relying on to continue that designation was not sufficient. And where do we stand today? Well, in Camp Ashraf, the organization that surrendered its arms and placed itself under international protection in 2003, to the point where the residents of Ashraf each received an identification card like this, like the one I'm holding up, designating them as protected persons under international law, has been attacked twice by Iraqi troops, once in July of 2009, once in April of 2011. At both times, when our Secretary of Defense was present in Iraq. The last time resulting in the murder of 35 defenseless women and men with weapons and vehicles supplied by the United States, operated by troops trained by the United States, and the United States has done nothing about it. In fact, all of the attack came from Iraqi troops who were photographed in the act of committing it. Some in the State Department have actually advocated resettling Ashraf residents elsewhere in Iraq, away from the Iranian border, as if the attack somehow had come from Iran. A sure way of making certain that the remaining residents of Ashraf could be obliterated completely out of the sight of the rest of the world. And what about the listing of MEK, which the Secretary of State was ordered in July of 2010 to reconsider? Well, 10 months later, that review has not been completed, and the State Department has offered no estimate of when it might be completed. Most recently, the State Department has purported to release from the allegedly classified record 10 documents that contain absolutely no information that is either new or relevant, and have questioned MEK representatives about all matter of irrelevancies. Let us take one example that I think lifts the lid off what is going on here. An unclassified State Department document reporting that when State Department officials questioned Iranians applying for visas to enter the United States from such places as Ankara, Baku, Berlin, Dubai, and Istanbul, these visa applicants reported that they regarded the MEK unfavorably. Now think about that. First of all, whether these Iranians think well or ill of MEK is not relevant to whether MEK should be listed as a foreign terrorist organization. But beyond that, the State Department is actually claiming with a straight face that when it lists MEK as a foreign terrorist organization and then asks people applying for visas what they think of MEK, the people they ask who are applying for visas to the country that lists MEK as a foreign terrorist organization say they hold unfavorable views toward MEK. A first-year college student who offered that kind of evidence to support a conclusion in a term paper would get an F. In other words, the State Department is engaged in a strategy of endless delay. Why? It is possible that a clue to the explanation lies in what happened in Libya, when France sent a warship and the United States sent a ferry boat that could not even depart when the sea was rough, and government officials explained that we did not want to act boldly so long as there were Americans in Libya. There are, as we know, 2 American students being held by Iran on trumped-up charges that they were spying. Is that it? I would suggest that perhaps a congressional hearing called by the House Foreign Affairs Committee could get to the bottom of it quickly. Whatever the reason, it's long past time for this country to act based on its principles, to delist MEK and thereby encourage those in Iran who are struggling for regime change, and to make certain that the residents of Ashraf are either permitted to remain where they are, with security provided by an international force, or that they are permitted to leave Iraq for other countries. The United States did not achieve greatness by taking the counsel of its fears, but rather by drawing inspiration from its ideals. It's time for the United States not only to be a great power, but also to act like one. Thank you very much.